Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Cyber. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday, where almost every week we try to give you something to help your threat hunting and security program. And today we're going to hop on an old topic that's going to make some people's eyes roll, and we're going to talk about Stuxnet, which happened a while ago. But the theme we want to use today is, would we catch a similar attack today, 15 years later? Have we learned from the past from Stuxnet? So we're going to take Stuxnet. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about how it worked, and then we'll make an argument for where today we might not have learned much from it. So let's jump into that. So what was Stuxnet? So back in June 2010, there was this rapidly spreading virus called Stuxnet that was detected by a virus block adder. The first variant, according to Kaspersky, was maybe seen in June 2009. There's others online that are saying, hey, this maybe started in 2005, 2007. What's interesting with this is really the consensus of the community is that this was believed to potentially target air-gapped Iranian nuclear enrichment in Natanz, which restarted in 2007. So a few years before they spun it down or claimed to spin it down, in 2007, this kind of corresponds with nuclear enrichment starting at Natanz again. What you have is a photo of an anti-aircraft gun out there at the actual site. Interesting thing here, as of this time, so Symantec in August 2010 said, though, 60% of the infected systems with Stuxnet were in Iran. So there are also kind of some interesting parts of this to where, hey, this seemed like it was something that was either super isolated, or maybe there's some credence to the fact that this was isolated down to this party. What did it actually do? How did this actually work? One of the kind of interesting things that pointed to a higher level of sophistication is you saw at least 4 CVEs from the Stuxnet attack. And we'll talk about these CVEs later. I'm going to hit kind of now an overview of what they are, so that when we hit them later, it will make sense. We saw 2 brand new CVs, one in Microsoft's print spooler service, one in LNK file execution. This was actually how Stuxnet propagated via USB. We'll talk about that here in a minute. And it also leveraged some recent CVs. So Conficker was a little bit earlier in the year. An RPC service vulnerability tied to MS-08067. Very popular Metasploit vulnerability also on all kinds of Windows systems that were vulnerable to it. What was interesting with this and where some of the attribution comes is this was a newer CVE that was seen earlier in the year with Conficker, but it had overlap with kind of another group. And then we saw an actual kernel vuln for MS-09025. So with this, again, this attacker, whoever was responsible for this, definitely had access to a lot of interesting things or was able to generate these up at their time. Something to note, fully patched computers at the time were infected. So if people are like, hey, you just didn't patch or you said this wasn't important, this wasn't relevant because, again, these CVEs were not actually in the Windows patch at the time. So interesting upfront on sophistication. Again, we'll talk where these came into the sequence of what Stuxnet actually did. But it's important to hit each of these at a time. So how it works, and this corresponds to the image on the left, nuclear enrichment, the site was air-gapped. And so they did the right thing. This wasn't just connected to the internet. And so these attackers, it's believed they use MS-10046, that LNK exploit, on a flash drive. What that LNK export did, it didn't rely on auto run being enabled. I don't think it was actually another part of the vulnerability in there, but that allowed anything that the flash drive plugged into to bridge the air gap to execute that, which then ran the next vulnerabilities that we'll talk about. Once that flash drive exploit ran, 10046, then 08067, the RPC service, that kernel vuln exploit we talked about, the print spooler exploit, those allowed lateral movement. Something to note here, right, is like, okay, well, if you're going to that air gap side, well, then that flash drive thing's how you got execution, then these other ones spread it around. If you had Windows systems connected to the internet at the time, those 3 vulns would have hit you. So not all of the start points were necessarily that flash drive. Again, if you had internet access, if you brought a system in, that system got infected, then that system went into another network. Those RPC service vulns, the kernel vulns, the parent spooler vulns, those would have allowed lateral movement in at the time. Another fascinating thing at this, there were stolen digital signatures from J-Micron and Realtek. Those were used for driver signing the kernel modules. And so one of the things Windows has to protect itself is, should I run this kernel module? And they use signing that's trusted. Stuxnet actually used stolen digital certificates from 2 somewhat major organizations to run its kernel modules. So that was really the IT side. And by IT side, I mean that's also like very, works on both in IT and OT networks. What was the specific OT things they did to cause the impact that they did? So the Windows things dropped on. Well, it turns out the Siemens WinCC endpoints, what are used for the engineering workstations and to load logic onto the PLCs, those are on Windows. So once Stuxnet reached those, it then did DLL load order hijacking. What this is you can drop a DLL in the Windows directory. It looks for it by name. It loads that DLL. They rename the legitimate one, put a second one in there. And so they were able to essentially hook or hijack comms between the legitimate driver and the illegitimate to create the network packet and do other things in there. That's how they intercepted comms on the Windows systems. There was also a CVE for a hard-coded password they used in WinCC database. So again, there was actually another CVE here. And what that hijacked library, what that DLL did was it took certain PLC comms and modified them. So that DLL, the legitimate one, generates the legitimate packet. Well, when it saw certain register values, when it saw certain parts of communication on there, it would change the values. And what's interesting here is this gets actually your Windows system that's reporting it to the user and what's actually going out on the wire. This is kind of that DLL in the middle that, they told the computer, hey, everything's fine. And out on the wire, they were sending completely different data. So you kind of have 2 very different levels of perception because of this technique. This library intercepts those communications between your programmable logic controller, your S7400, your S7300, in the SCADA server there. Stuxnet also was able to modify project files. I know Ralph Langner has a write-up out there that digs, I think, deeper into this. He's one of the big sources on, he has one of the big sources on his report on this. So, this wasn't a point to dig Stuxnet kind of out of being 15 years old. This was a question of, will we catch it today? And, the argument that we're making, what we want to kind of push forward with this content is there are many ways that asset owners today would still struggle with these techniques. And we see 3 areas that we'll dive into, right? The IT and OT divide and the dismissal of IT techniques, right? Kind of the snowflake syndrome of, hey, OT is so different. OT needs its own thing. We can't use any of that stinking IT stuff. Well, that doesn't actually historically hold up well, right? It definitely is different, but if you're not considering the IT parts of your OT network and how it integrates in, then, don't be surprised if these techniques work against you. The misbalance between network and host monitoring strategy, we'll talk about that in the opinionated, could that never happen here type threat intel around vulns. So let's jump into those. So the first one, right, this IT-OT divide, the dismissal of IT techniques. Hey, this sounds too IT, it won't work in OT. OT is too different. Well, Stuxnet leveraged multiple Windows vulns. Almost everything we saw there was a Windows vuln. The hooking of the communication library to generate the OT traffic was technically done in Windows. This was not, targeted malware to, well, it was technically targeted to Siemens, but this wasn't like, they wrote their own communication driver to do it. They just modified a part of Windows. WinCC, the application they modified, runs on Windows. The somatic HMIs, the actual hardware HMIs, run on Windows CV or on Windows C. These weren't hit, luckily not, but The vulns, it's the same kernel. There's still opportunity to impact these. Other OEMs, to not just pick on Siemens, still use Windows, right? And so again, this is where when we talk about the risk, it's not as simple as like, okay, well, use OT tools on OT and we don't need the IT tools. It's, hey, we still have exposure here. Another thing that we see and another kind of attitude that's alarming and kind of leads to people not being prepared for next examples of these is you look at MITRE enterprise attack, right? DLL load order hijacking, it's T1574001. ICS attack has no direct corollary. And so when we go into places and they're like, we don't need to use enterprise attack, this is an OT network. Well, no, that's not true. You kind of do have to consider both. If you read MITRE's white paper, if you talk to people from the MITRE attack team, most that I've talked to have said, use both. The white paper says you have to use both, right? And so again, when we're talking on these techniques, it's important not just to say it is important to use the ICS ones, it's also important to bring the other ones in and make sure you're actually focusing on them. This is one to where I can't think of a single time that I've been asked on DLO load order hijacking, over the last few years. Some of it's become harder to do, right? There's other things that play in there. But again, if we're not looking at these techniques, if we're not like, hey, how would I find that? We're going to be in a challenging spot. Many in the OT community, again, dismiss needing both. And that doesn't historically hold up well. Because let's talk about the other time that Windows vulns cost industrial asset owners a lot of money in downtime. We look at WannaCry 17010 with 2017-0144. OT systems today also rely on SMB. SMB is a strong IT protocol. It's technically just an IT vuln in a lot of world, or in a lot of, by definition. But again, if we don't learn from the fact that, yes, OT is different in some ways, but it still has all of the risk structure of, or risk problems of IT in it, you're going to continue to get hurt by these. WannaCry, massive downtime, massive, costs. There's a safety side that we won't even get into on that. But again, we have to kind of learn that, and we can't let this division get in the way of us. Second area we think will be challenging, or using this as a case study is challenging. There's very much a strong network monitoring approach today. And the challenge with Stuxnet is that if you are just using network monitoring, you have to be ready to look at legitimate OT protocol traffic, so a well-formed S7COM, a well-formed Modbus packet, and look for those values in that legitimately formed packet being modified in a way that's malicious. And by the way, this is coming from a malicious host. So if you're just saying, hey, just look for the time that these hosts communicate, that wouldn't have helped you with Stuxnet. If you're looking at cases to where, you're looking at pairs of that, if you're using certain ML things, depending on how that ML algorithm's built, this might not calculate as newness, right? Again, you look at that DLL load order hijacking, you look at some of the other techniques that were taken, you look at those CVEs. A lot of those CVEs are going to be challenging to find on the network. They're easier now because we know how to see some of the vulns, but if you don't know how to see those vulns, you're likely not going to see the vulns on the network. You're going to have to go to host data. When you go to host data, what you get is you get the option to then say, okay, let me look for files dropped on disk. Let me look in Siemens folder and say, hey, I see 2 DLLs here. One's a legitimate named with the wrong hash. The other one has a letter changed, and hey, the hash actually matches the hash of the legitimate DLL, or what I expect to see. There are other things in host artifacts you can see there. So again, kind of going all in on network and not considering host, it would be very hard to see Stuxnet today if you are just looking at the OT protocol traffic itself. Because again, the packet that you're looking for, the packets that you're looking for are hiding in just a mountain of data that likely no group has the ability to look at alone if you're just looking at network. The other thing, the change in operating state would be noticed, right? So what I mean by this is if you look physically, if that turbine, if those centrifuges are spinning faster than the computer, indicates, or there's a mismatch between what a safety system, what another system is reporting, what other measurement is reporting basis on the system, that would be a way that you could get to that, and potentially bringing in other data sources. You might be able to see that because there's still not a lot of canaries, right, on those integrity checks, right? The challenge too to those stolen certificates is, the signed, and this was for the kernel or for the kernel modules being signed by those stolen certificates. Again, signing integrity is compromised. So, is the malware signed by a legitimate certificate? Is the certificate legitimate? Yes. Is it the file that should be signed? Absolutely not. But depending on the tool you're using, your tools are just going to say, okay, yep, this is signed by a cert that is trusted, by Microsoft or by whoever the certificate authority that signed it is, right? So again, like this is where when you're only looking at host data, or when you're only looking at network and you're not considering both network and host, it can be really hard to see just with the amount of noise. Finally, the third area we think this, or we see this as a challenge is the opinionated could never happen here threat intel, right? We see attitudes where it's like, okay, well, that's just a Windows vuln. It's probably not important. Or, hey, we can't patch, or we can't afford to patch until a scheduled downtime. Well, it is important. You do have to consider your downtimes. At the same time, you have to know when you say like, hey, do we bring production down now, and do we patch for something like WannaCry, or do we wait for WannaCry to hit us, deal with having to clean up WannaCry and then patch? Well, the risk calculations there of patching might actually be more advantageous than having to kind of put together a strong case for why you need to do an out of band maintenance window on there. And so we can't be scared as a community to say, hey, this patch is very important, and try to do it before you have an incident like WannaCry, right? The full risk needs to be understood, right? It's more sophisticated also than just listening to a third party say you need to patch this immediately versus next turnaround versus never. They're going off of their understanding of the industry. Your understanding and your operations could actually be different than this. Again, a key thing to note here is patches wouldn't have helped you on Stuxnet. Again, the vulns that Stuxnet used, the CVEs, were not patched at the time. However, WannaCry, those vulnerabilities were patched about 2 months before WannaCry actually happened. So if you patched before WannaCry, you were safe. If you didn't, and if that maintenance window didn't fall in 2 months, well, you dealt with WannaCry. And as an organization, again, you have to consider, hey, is the risk of getting hit by WannaCry more important than the risk of, or the cost of doing that, emergency shutdown to get it patched? IT does matter because, again, you're not just like, let's pull the Windows out or Windows systems, let's pull the systems out until we can do it. That's not possible. It's engineered in, right? So we need to do a better job of weighing critical services in the probability opinion and understanding those control system components, right? With WannaCry, SMB was the key part. SMB is still an essential part of a lot of control systems. With Stuxnet, you look at those 4 vulns, those are all core parts of Windows that you can't really turn off. And with L and K exploit, you can't, that's not something you can enable or disable by a setting. The only thing to do to fix that is to deal with it, or is to actually push the patch. So, doing a better job and not just taking kind of the surface level, don't patch, never patch, maybe patch kind of opinions is going to be key for operations. So today, again, we wanted to take WannaCry as an example and talk through areas that we see as a potential challenge of ways that asset owners might not detect it today, right? Because one of our advantage of Defenders is we can use our knowledge of these past events to help secure us, but we have to learn from those knowledge, and we have to kind of, always remember those points, always push for using those learning points. So hopefully this was helpful. We hope to see you back next week. If there's any questions or comments, please put them below. Thank you.